So it's pretty safe to say that a lot of artists are obsessed with their materials, and especially mediums. And there used to be the only resources that used to be out there were like older books, artist handbook, and any material books from mostly the 19th century. And those can be really insightful as far as techniques go, but they can also be damaging if you follow what they say to the letter, because the common there was no main standard stable medium that people used. The old master medium, it's all a lie. There is no um, magic medium that is going to make your paint look like the old masters, whatever that means. So, and there's a lot to be said about mediums that I'm not going to say, because smarter people are saying it. And you can check out Natural Pigments. They have a website, naturalpigments.com. And Georgia Hanlon, who's over there at Natural Pigments, he's extremely accessible on Facebook. And there's a group that you can join on Facebook for Natural Pigments. And pretty much any question that you could ask, you can ask him. And he's going to come at it with science and testing, and that's how it should be done, because what was happening in the 19th century was a free-for-all. It was just experiment, whatever people wanted to throw in paintings, in paint mixtures, they were doing it. They were throwing bitumen in paint. They were throwing, really acidic, nasty stuff that, we can see now doesn't stand up the test of time. So the best rule of thumb when it comes to mediums, first off, is stay the hell away from Damar. Damar varnish is the devil. It will fuck your paintings up. And I know this from personal experience and from reading up on the long-term effects of Damar. It's just a sticky resin that is really hard to work with if you make even the slightest error in mixing it, and it can amount to a disaster painting, like sanding it down and painting it over, kind of stuff, just because of how sticky it can get, how tacky it becomes. You don't want to be pulling at your paint unless that's a specific kind of effect that you're going for. If that's the case, that's a whole nother story. If it's not the case, stay away from Damar, especially if you want your paintings to last. That being besides the point, any medium you put in your paint increases the risk of cracking, of something going wrong. So that's generally just what I tell my students. Like, just know that right off the bat, anything that you put in your paint is going to be subject to error eventually. So far more so than if you just don't use medium. So I tend to, my method really on how I approach things is that if I'm going to use medium, it's going to be in the beginning. I try to use medium that is that yellows the least. I'm a real big fan of walnut oil and walnut alkyd medium, and alkyd is just a synthetic process of making the walnut oil dry faster. So it's and there's a lot more to that. I'm simplifying it just for the sake of this, so you can expect walnut oil and a walnut alkyd to handle like walnut oil, with the exception of a slightly faster dry time. Walnut oil has really good dry time, and like all day today, I was painting all day today, and by the end of the paint session, I started in the morning, I'm done now at about 5 o'clock, and the paint is setting up. It's starting to set up. It's getting, it's getting that initial paint film hardening, as not only on the palette, but also like on the canvas as well. So it's, and I don't paint really thin. I paint in different thicknesses depending on what I feel like the painting needs. And so I'm showing a couple pictures here of two different brushes. Now, if you look at the anatomy of a brush really quick, because I think it's important to note the full effects of medium. Everyone talks about medium as being relating to what it does to the paint, but while I think it's also important to consider what it can do to your materials, to your brushes, especially because brushes are very expensive, and you don't want to have to buy a ton of brushes constantly. You don't have to keep buying more brushes if you don't have to, right? It's always nice to get a new brush, but at the same time, if you get a really nice used brush that you've been using for years because you've been taking care of it, it'll always serve you better than a brand new brush. At least it does for me. So, the anatomy of the brush, you got the tip, right? You got the belly of the bristles, and then you got the heel, right? The end of the brush bristles that meet the metal, which is called the ferrule, and that takes you to the handle. So basic brush anatomy. So when you use medium, these two pictures show what happens using medium in one brush versus not using any medium on the other brush. Now, I can shovel paint on with a brush without any medium on it whatsoever, and the absorption rate of the brush bristles is, as you can see in the picture, it's lower. It's much lower. It's going to hold the paint instead of just suck all the paint up, because the paint is being thinned out, and it can more easily get sucked up into the bristles. And so the difference between the two, obviously, is that the brush that I'm using the medium in, the pigments suck all the way up to the base of the ferrule. And that is the hardest place to clean. The heel of the brush is the hardest place to clean when you're cleaning your brush. And if paint gets up in there, what happens is years and years and years of doing this, if you're loading up with a lot of medium and you're loading up your brush when you're painting, more paint gets into the heel, and then you're not going to be able to get all the paint out of it. You're not going to be able to wash it perfectly every time. There are going to be times when you don't wash the paint out fully, and then with the addition of having used medium, it sets up that much faster and it dries in the heel. As paint dries in the heel of a brush, it starts to separate the bristles. When it separates the bristles, they lose their form. So it's another reason for brush care, especially, that you reform your brushes after you use them, especially if you use medium. If you don't ever use medium, like I tend to use medium again just in the beginning, and then the more I go with the painting, the less I use it. But usually by the second stage, by the second pass, I'm done using medium, unless it's for some kind of effect. And if then, especially if I'm painting on a panel. But if I want to achieve some kind of effect, then that might alter something that I would put in the painting, like a medium, like a calcite medium, or something to thicken up the paint. Again, they have a lot of additives for mediums at Natural Pigments, where I mainly get my stuff at. So there's a lot of fun stuff to experiment with, especially if you paint on panel. You can get away with experimenting a lot more. But back on the brushes, if using the medium over the years and having it not be fully washed out, you're gradually ruining your brushes. So if you consider that to be really sound in your methods requires not using as much medium. If you use too much medium, you're essentially not using sound methods. There are a lot of people who load up, they do these terp washes, and it's just insane to me that, like, if you add terp to your paint, you're degrading the paint. It's just what it is. It's it's being degraded. It's weakening the film, the structure of the paint, and at any layer that you do this in, you're going to weaken the structure of the paint. So the people who do turp washes, it doesn't matter how skilled they are. They're not painting properly. And so I highly recommend not doing turp washes. Not only is it bad for your health, but it's bad for the paint and bad for your brushes. And I just wouldn't recommend it at all, especially turp. But heavy medium washes are generally only good in the beginning. It dries faster, sets yourself up. That's why I try to get as much done as possible, with in the early stages, because you get the most flow if you're using medium. And then if you get a lot done in the early stages, in the first pass, then it's so much easier to not need medium, because you're adding to smaller forms that, as opposed to larger ones that you were covering in the first pass, as far as actual paint application goes. So yeah, I thought it would just be fun to show pictures of the brushes after having used one without any medium whatsoever versus one with medium, and how just considering that if you're buying really expensive brushes and you really want them to last, it's important to adopt more sound methods to help all around. But it covers not just painting, not just the paint on the canvas. It also covers your other materials like your brushes. So it's just something to consider, and it's an aspect of the craft that is fun to learn about, but it can be really overwhelming. So there's just a lot to have to consider as a painter. So this might just be one little thing that I found that I think can help.